Well, noswaith dda bawb. Good evening, everybody. Y croeso cynnes iawn I chi gyd I ddarlith rithiol arall gan y Comisiwn. Heno, bydd hanner genders bwyd a Toby Driver yn cyflwyno taith o'ch cadair freichiau o amgylch caer bentir Flimston. Mae'n rhywbeth o arbrawf, felly byddwn ni'n gwerthfawrogi eich adborth. A very warm welcome to you all to another Commission online lecture. Tonight, Toby Driver and Hannah Genders Boyd from the CHERISH team are presenting an armchair tour of Flimston Promontory Fort. It's a bit of an experiment, so we'd appreciate your feedback. You're welcome to ask any questions. Hannah and Toby will be happy to answer them, but please write your questions in the Q&A function. We'd be grateful if you don't use the chat for the questions. Thanks. The tour will be recorded and shared on other platforms. For those not watching this live, you're also welcome to send us any questions or share your comments, and Hannah and Toby will reply to them as soon as possible. Bydd y sgwrs hon drwy gyfrwng y Saesneg heno, cofiwch fod croeso I chi gysylltu â ni yn y Gymraeg os ydych chi'n am ofyn cwestiwn neu adael sylw. Hoffwn nawr y gyflwyno ein siaradwyr heno, sef Toby Driver a Hannah Genders Boyd. Yn gyntaf, Toby. Toby yw ymchwilydd awyrol y Comisiwn Brenhinol, ac mae hefyd wedi gweithio ar y prosiect CHERISH ers camau cyntaf y prosiect, yn 2016. Mae'n gweithio ar arolygion o'r awyr a dronau i'r Comisiwn Brenhinol a CHERISH. Mae hefyd yn arbenigo mewn archeoleg Bryngeiri'r yr Oes Haearn, y Cymru cyn hanesyddol diweddarach a Cymru Rufeinig. Toby is the senior aerial investigator for the Royal Commission and has also worked on the CHERISH project since the project design stage in 2016. He works on aerial survey and drone survey for the Royal Commission and CHERISH, and also specialises in the archaeology of Iron Age hill forts and later prehistoric and Roman Wales. Mae Hannah yn weithio'r treftadaeth hinsawdd proffesiynol sydd wedi gweithio o'r blaen yn y sectorau cyhoeddus ac addysg uwch yn yr Alban. Mae ei diddordebau ymchwil yn cynnwys newid tirwedd cyn hanesyddol a sut mae ei hymgylchedd yn effeithio'r gymunedau. Rhannu straeon hinsawdd a threftadaeth trwy cerdded a theithwyr yw'r rhan orau o ei swydd gyda CHERISH. Hannah is a climate heritage professional who has previously worked in the public and higher education sectors in Scotland. Her research interests include prehistoric landscape change and how communities are impacted by their environment. Sharing climate change and heritage stories through walks and tours is the best part of her job with CHERISH. Felly, a hynny o eiriau drosodd I Hannah a Toby.
Brilliant. Diolch, Dave. All right, so welcome indeed. Thank you so much for joining us for this CHERISH armchair walk. As Dave said, it's a wee bit of an experiment, and yeah, it's an exciting opportunity for us to really get you out on site and show you around one of the amazing sites that we work on with CHERISH. So just to give you a bit of information, we were filming it out on the fort last Friday, which was a lovely day, but it was very windy. So I need to apologise for some of the wind noise that you'll hear on the mic and on the film. It does mean that we've had to edit the film a little bit, and at some points you'll hear the sound drop. Don't worry, it will come back, but that's just to take away the worst of the wind noise. And that, yeah, so it might be slightly windier in certain places, and then when we find a bit more shelter in the fort, it will be a little bit less windy, so maybe bear with us. It's overall about 20 minutes long, the film, so that's what you can expect. And at the end of that, we'll have a Q&A session live with Toby and myself, so you can come back and join us live, and we'll answer any questions that you've got for us then. Unfortunately, with that wind noise, we did have to completely lose some of our conversation at the start and at the end of the tour. So Toby will fill you in at the end with what was lost there, and I'll fill you in just now with what was lost at the start, which was in fact just a very brief explanation of the CHERISH project. So to let you know what that is and what we do, the CHERISH project is a climate heritage project. It stands for Climate Heritage and Environments of Reef Islands and Headlands. What is that? Well, that's a 6-year EU-funded project. It's funded through the Ireland-Wales programme. So we have 4 project partners, both here in Wales and over in Ireland. We're the Royal Commission as one of those partners. And then we also work with Aberystwyth University. And then in Ireland, the Discovery Programme, which is an archaeological programme, and the Geological Survey of Ireland. And the purpose of this whole project has been to use a wide range of scientific techniques to survey and record vulnerable coastal archaeological sites before they're lost to climate change. So why is climate change causing us to lose heritage sites on the coast? Well, you might know, or you might not know, that human-induced climate change is being caused by an increased release in carbon dioxide, CO2, which is dramatically increased since our industrial revolution. And particularly since the 1960s, we have very good data to show just what that's doing to our climate. The headline that you might well have seen is that since the 1960s, we've experienced a 1 degree increase in global temperatures. So that's what's already happened. There's a projection that within this century, we could potentially see a 4 degree centigrade increase in global temperatures. That's part of the data from the UK CP18 dataset, which is the UK climate projection data. Hopefully that won't happen. And there's a lot of people around the world working very hard to make sure we stay within a 1.5 degree percentage, 1.5 degree Celsius increase. But of course, that is in itself a very big change in global temperatures. The kind of less big headline that you might have seen are things like the increase in precipitation, so rainfall, and that's something that really affects us here on the West Coast, so in Wales and then again in Ireland, that increased rainfall is a really big problem for our coastal heritage. So parts of Northwest Britain have seen an 80 to 100% increase in rainfall annually since the 1960s. And a lot of that rainfall is focused on the winter. So a phrase you might have heard is warmer, wetter winters and hotter, drier summers. And that's not a hard and fast rule, but that's the kind of trend we've seen. And it's the kind of trend we'll continue to see over the coming years. So that means more extremes of rainfall, and more extremes of temperature, and more extremes of things like storms. So an increase in storminess, you might have noticed there seem to be more named storm events happening. We've had winters where we've had a named storm every week for a month, and that's a direct impact of climate change. And well, what's that affecting on the coast? You can imagine that's having an effect on coastal erosion. So coastal erosion is a natural process that might be affected by geology or the soils or footfall or rainfall or wave action. And climate change is having an effect on a lot of those aspects. So in this film, you'll see at the start, we started at the outside edge of the Promontory fort, and you'll notice there's a really good example of some coastal erosion happening there, partly because the soil is a beautiful bright red, so you can really see where that erosion's happening. And you'll notice that there's been some fencing put up around it, which is a really nice example of one of the ways that a site is being managed to try and mitigate that effect of coastal erosion. So in this instance, the fencing is there to reduce footfall, and that in itself can just help the soil bounce back a little bit and not be worsened by people walking over it. So that's a nice example of a way that the more we understand about sites, the more we understand about the ways that climate change is affecting sites and the ways that coastal erosion is affecting sites, the better we can mitigate and manage and also research and understand. So I think that's a good place to launch in. So Marissa, if you could take us to Flimston, that would be wonderful.
Oh, finally some quiet out of the wind.
Absolutely. Good evening. We're just taking the opportunity of a quiet spot out of the wind to give you a quick introduction to the video tonight.
Yeah, so hi, I'm Hannah Genders-Boyd. I'm the Survey and Outreach Officer with CHERISH.
I'm Toby Driver. I'm the Senior Aerial Investigator with the Royal Commission and also on the CHERISH project.
So we're really grateful you can join us for this armchair walk. We've been doing a series of outreach walks over the course of the summer, largely along some of the amazing sites in Pembrokeshire and around the coast of Wales. But we're aware that not everyone's been able to join us for that, so we wanted to do something that was accessible and that you could join at from home. So this is the first time we've tried something like this, and it's definitely been quite an experience.
It has. You'll see the results in a moment. We've got a beautiful sunny day here in Flimston Bay, but it's been exceptionally windy. So the picture does rattle around a bit, and occasionally you'll lose our voices to the wind noise, but we hope you'll bear with us for a very real experience of visiting this site if you're not able to get here yourself. So sit back and enjoy, and we'll be here for questions afterwards.
See you then. Hello, good evening.
Hiya, you right?
My name's Hannah
I'm Toby.
and we're here for the armchair walk. So welcome to our armchair walk at Flimston Promontory Fort. We've just left the car and we're going to walk down to the Promontory Fort and show you around. But we've got a beautiful night here, but we have got quite a lot of wind. So please bear with us if there's some wind noise on the mic.
Yes, we've got an incredible walk ahead of us, so we're going to see what we see as we go. But it's quite a way down we've come, isn't it? It's about as far as you can get in winds, isn't it?
It really is, yeah. We've just been driving for the last 2.5 hours to get here from Aberystwyth. So we're now really very much on the south coast of Wales. We feel like we've come right to the edge of it all, this Promontory Fort.
And it's a good 20 minutes south even of Pembroke, and we're at the Staciau'r car park, just along from Flimston Bay Promontory Fort. But I'll set the scene a bit and tell you a bit about the range as we start walking. So shall we start walking?
Yeah, let's get going.
So we're lucky enough, very grateful in fact, to the Defence Infrastructure Organisation who've allowed us to film tonight on the edge of the Castle Martin training area. So the Castle Martin training area in South Pembrokeshire is one of 12 military ranges in Britain, and it was requisitioned for military use in 1938. It was given back in 1945, but then rapidly retaken into army use in 1948 prior to the Korean War in 1950. So the archaeology that we're going to see, the Promontory Fort we're going to see, exists within this military training area. Now we'll just pass through the stile here, the gate.
Thank you.
It's really interesting, these army ranges over the decades have become real microcosms of conservation care and interest. We've got some great heritage sites here, great wildlife sites. They've been spared the ravages of intensive agriculture over the last 70-80 years. So what we find now on these army training ranges is that the archaeology is really very well preserved and well cared for. We'll be seeing some of that today.
So yeah, we're now
So we're here now at Flimston Bay Coastal Promontory Fort. It's probably a good idea to explain quickly what promontory forts are.
That sounds like a good plan.
We're going back to the Iron Age today. We're going back to pre-Roman times, probably about 300 to 400 BC, when this great fortified coastal settlement was occupied. Now, the Romans came to Britain, landed in Kent AD 43, conquered most of Wales in the late 60s and 70s AD. So we're looking at a site that's had occupation potentially for about 300 to 400 years at least. There's been no excavations here, so we don't know if the Romans reoccupied this site. And what we've got is a promontory fort. It's a defensive site built right at the coast edge. I've got a plan here. I'm just going to hold it up. You can just about see that. We've got D-shaped ramparts blocking off the coast edge here. One great outer rampart, two tight inner ramparts, and that's your defence, stopping you getting to this main promontory here where all the houses and the settlement were inside. So hold that in your eyes if you can as you walk around the site, and we'll explain it as we go and visit it.
Brilliant. So shall we go and get a closer look at these ramparts that you've just pointed out on the plan there?
Absolutely, yeah. So what we have now today, we're lucky to have very low light now at the end of the day. It's showing up these banks and ditches really very well. Now we're on the inner defences of Flimston Bay Coastal Promontory Fort now, and what you see in front of you is entirely artificial and built. If we just have a pause here, we can see the deep ditch below us, originally much deeper, cut out through the limestone bedrock, and above it the great steep rampart. And this is a ruin of what was originally standing here. We know this would have been walled with this lovely white yellow limestone walling, and on top you'd have this solid defensive timber work like a fence. Now Hannah, you just point things out. I'm going to run up to the top of the rampart. These ramparts don't look very big until you actually put a person in the picture, so bear with me.
This is a great opportunity to really see them in perspective. Toby's got a 1 metre ranging rod. But yeah, now he's on top, you can see, wow, just how huge that is. Really, really massive. And this is of course a ruin of what originally had been here. This is a 2,000-year-old ruin, so you can imagine just how grand and impressive this would have been in the heyday.
So, you know, we're going to walk around the side of this great rampart now. Why enclose in the Iron Age? I mean, is it just to keep attacking marauders out of the fort, or is it for other purposes? And certainly a big defensive wall like this would keep enemies or wild animals out, but it's as much about power and prestige and ownership of this coast edge as it is about a practical defence. It's about projecting your power as the leader of this fort out across the landscape and striking awe and fear into the hearts of anybody approaching it. That's really what it's all about. So we've got a bit of wind here now. We're going to just turn around here, probably get ourselves a bit of shelter from the wind.
Yeah, that's a good shout.
Now we're at the entrance. Now we're not going to see the outer defence that lies out here because it's quite overgrown. So all the way around, you see this pole here, all the way around on the horizon, we've got this great curving outer defence. But if we turn around, we're going to go to the main inner gateway here. There's a bit of shelter. Now we can see here, can't we, Hannah? The remains of this great gateway. So just into the sun there, not ideal, but we're going into the outer gateway of this coastal promontory fort. So this would originally have had a great timber gateway standing here, an entrance passage ahead of you, and if you weren't expected as a visitor at this site, you would have been in trouble. So the main common defence of the people manning the ramparts here, the warriors or just people from the fort, would have been small beach pebbles. They could have used that as a slingshot to fire at you from about 60 metres away and fracture your skull. So if you're not expected here as a visitor, there'd be angry shouts, people running to the top of the rampart to keep you away, and a hail of slingshot. Now let's assume that we're welcome here. There'd still be a lot of interest, and this would be quite a show here as we came to the gateway.
Yeah, I mean, we're, as well as thinking about defence and the kind of military aspect of what's going on here, there has certainly been an awful lot of pomp and circumstance as we arrive. So if we are welcome guests at this hill fort, we can imagine a lot of business, a lot of people watching us come in, and certainly we would have known how to behave appropriately to come here. So we've been guided in around ramparts, following a route that follows a particular line, and we're now being guided into the main gateway, which would have had huge platforms the other side and would have been a very grand entryway into a very large project.
It's worth saying as well before we go in that if we'd approached the site, we still have no way of seeing what's inside. These ramparts are a complete visual barrier. It would have been surprising and uncertain, and as you're welcomed in, you don't know what to expect. So we go through this outer gate here. The wind is still blustery, and we come just going to go to the top of this outer rampart. You'll see where the gateway once stood. We have this inner rampart here now, another gateway probably, and then we come out of that gateway passage into the interior of the fort. And I guess if you can, imagine even something like airport customs where you're going through the stress of being observed, that's similar to what you would have had through a hill fort gateway. The checks, the questions, the darkness, and then out into the light of the hill fort interior.
If we were indeed walking through in the Iron Age, we would be seeing suddenly a huge amount of hustle and bustle coming through from the outside where we couldn't see what was going on, to suddenly smoke and fires, people making things, people living their lives, people cooking, and potentially quite a number of structures here. So we're going to have a little look to see if we can see the remains of some of those structures.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, we've got quite a few of these scoops surviving around us now. There's one just up here. If we can get it so we can talk out of the wind, we'll have a look.
That would be ideal.
Shall we have a look? Up on the right here we've got some, haven't we? Those are in shade.
This.
Shall we go down to this one in the
This
shade?
one,
It's a bit more
perfect,
sheltered
yeah.
down here as well. So Hannah, we know that the interior has about 20 roundhouses in it, and I can, if you want to film this, shall I sort of stand around and show people where the roundhouse was?
That sounds good. Cool. So Toby's going to get in there and show you the sort of depression in the side of the hill fort that we can see here that is the remains of where a roundhouse would have sat. So this would have been a slightly scooped platform to create a flat surface to make your roundhouse. So it's a very sensible way of creating a really cosy home, and also, as you can see, would be slightly built into the side of the cliff. So that would offer a little bit of shelter as well. And we know that in the Iron Age and before that, people were building in the round. So roundhouses, quite literally, homes without corners. And that would have been very effective for working with this kind of windy environment. So it's a much better way of allowing the wind to move around your house and much less likely to knock it down.
So this is a house that would draw on the landscape, isn't it, as well, in terms of how they were building these structures?
Absolutely. So we have some quite good evidence for what a roundhouse would have looked like from different parts of the UK. And we know that really they would have been using a lot of different aspects of their environment to create these structures. So maybe post built with a local woodland wood such as birch. There might have been something like a wattle or interior screen, maybe made out of willow. So that would have made quite a warm structure. And it might well have had a thatch. And that's something that there's all different kinds of thatch in different parts of the country depending on what you're growing locally and what makes sense. Even on the coast there's evidence of seaweed thatch from Scotland, or there might have been different kinds of thatch depending on what was being grown in the local environment.
A smelly roof there, a seaweed thatch.
Maybe, yeah.
I think people come to these sites. We just pan around to the left here.
Very beautiful.
We can see how exposed this promontory is today to the wind, and people get concerned, I think, about how comfortable life would have been here.
Yeah.
But I suppose a roundhouse, well built, would have been a supremely cosy house and stormproof.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that's really worth remembering, that roundhouses, when we think of them in these little kind of cosy cut-out platforms here, we can imagine like a very, very comfortable way of life, very cosy way of life. Also structures that would have been needed to be created by a number of people together, so we can think of them as a community effort to build this kind of house.
Quite a challenging place to raise a family though, and to have livestock here. It's an interesting idea nowadays to see quite a dangerous interior here, really, isn't it, with these steep cliff drops. We've got a reconstruction drawing here which gives a sense of a sort of imaginary sense of how the hill fort may have looked in the past. We don't know how many roundhouses were contemporary at the time, but we can see how the ramparts may have appeared on the isthmus here. Some houses scattered around the interior, and possibly even boats pulled up on the beaches below as well.
Nice scene.
So we're inside the fort now. We've come through these great ramparts. We've come through the gateway. We have about 20 of these roundhouse scoops, these house platforms in the interior. But there's one rather shocking and dramatic feature in this interior that we're going to go across to now. Visited by Richard Fenton in the early part of the 19th century and named the Cauldron. We don't know what the wind's going to be like up there, but let's have a look. So we're going to walk up the hill here. Yeah, exactly. Now, if you haven't been to Flimston Bay Coastal Promontory Fort, this is a feature you don't find in every coastal promontory fort. There's about 60 coastal promontory forts in the whole of Pembrokeshire, and some are quite regular settlements and places to live, but occasionally some contain enormous chasms, blowholes, unusual outcrops and other features which are quite strange to see in the hillfort interior. Now we're just coming to the edge of the canal, aren't we?
Yeah, you can barely see it until we're right on top of it.
Well, looking at the sun here, we can pan around a bit to the left there. You can see this enormous chasm in front of us. It's a huge natural blowhole in the interior of the promontory fort, and right down there below you can see the waves breaking through a sea cave. It's pointing with a stick down there as well. It's a huge and dangerous feature. Shall we walk around so we can look back at it?
We might even be able to see it behind us if we
Exactly.
hold it this way.
It's a huge and dangerous feature in the centre of this promontory fort. We know, looking at the erosion rates inside this blowhole, it's probably been here for a long time. It's not actively eroding. And it's very likely that it was here in a very similar form in prehistoric times. And then we can look back at it now. So, how do we consider this huge feature within the fort? Well, we know from Iron Age times we have the repeated deposition of prestige metalwork, swords, shields, fragments of chariot fittings in the liminal and remote and dangerous parts of the natural landscape, upland lakes, peat bogs, dark caves. And we know from contemporary records of Iron Age religions that these would seem to be the places where the human landscape crossed over to the other world. There are places where the world of the dead, the world of the gods, came into the world of the living. And so we have lakes like Llanfawr, Votive Lake in South Wales, where quantities of cauldrons and swords and shields are thrown into the dark, peaty waters. Or Llancerrig Bach on Anglesey, where we have a dark, peaty lake with a rock platform extending into it, where objects are cast away to the gods. And if you lived inland and the sea was a strange place, you would have come to this great blowhole with waves crashing, echoing, seabirds coming up it. And it may be that this was a very significant sacred feature inside the coastal promontory fort. There's no way of telling, we haven't done any excavations or any work here, of how this blowhole was considered. But given it's such an unusual feature here, perhaps this is one of the key reasons that this particular promontory here was enclosed with ramparts and shut off and owned by the tribe here. It's a very interesting thing to consider how and why this may have been used. So perhaps at key times of year, people visited Flimston just to visit this great hole, or perhaps they cast objects into it. We don't know, that's supposition.
We don't know, but I mean, even seeing it now, it's such an incredible and such an exciting thing to experience, that you can imagine people coming in the Iron Age and having a very, very similar experience as we are today.
And as we walk around now, we're walking around the back of Flimston Promontory Fort, around this huge chasm. The land is narrowing all the time and getting more liminal. Liminal's a word archaeologists use a lot. It describes the sort of interface between two different places. And here we're at the very edge of the land, the very edge of the promontory fort, looking out over the sea. Exactly the sort of places that were revered in Iron Age society and Iron Age religion. These places to commune with the gods and their
Thank you for joining us here.
And we're around for questions after the talk as well.
Yeah, so we'll see you for questions in just a moment.
Thank you, Dr. Well, there we are. I hope everyone survived the experience of walking around Flimston in that strong wind and bright sunshine. I'm just going to pop in at the end here. As you'll appreciate, we lost the video a little bit at the end of the walk there. And what we missed out, a couple of things. We missed out the final view along the coast. Flimston dominates the coast here, but it has some world famous coastal scenery, a legging stack rocks, the Green Bridge, natural arch as well. Those would have been different structures, maybe entirely different 2,000 years ago, of course. But we have this stunning coastal scenery. And perhaps that's another thing that added to the kudos of the people living in the Promontory fort here. And also what we missed was a view out across the Severn Estuary, the Bristol Channel. When we get to Flimston, you think, oh, sites like these coastal promontory forts, you feel like they're at the edge of Wales. You're far from the modern world. You're as far as you can go. But of course, 2,000 years ago, these sites were pointing into international seaways. Wales was very well visited in prehistory. These seaways were used by Mediterranean shipping from, well, the earliest visitors we have was the Greek mariner Pytheas in 340 BC, who sailed around the Welsh coast and Cornish coast as well and recorded what Wales looked like. We know we have good evidence for trade leading up to the Roman conquest as well. We have things like a lead anchor stock off Bardsey Island from a Mediterranean ship dating to around 100 BC. So a century before the Romans came to Wales, a Mediterranean ship foundered off Bardsey Island, possibly trading with the locals, possibly seeking gold or copper on Anglesey, we don't know. We only have the anchor. But these sites like Flimston, from time to time, would have had visitors from France, Greece, Spain, turning up on their doorstep and trading and talking to them and dealing as well. So really interesting things to think about the connectivity of these sites back in prehistoric times. So we hope you've enjoyed that armchair walk, and I think we're going to open up now to questions and answers, Dave.
We are indeed, Toby. And talking about Hannah and Toby, I'm a daith ddorol amgylch caer, bentir, Flimston. Thanks, Hannah and Toby, for that very interesting, engaging trip around Flimston Fort. Rydyn ni wedi ambell i sylw ar question. I'm going to start off with what's probably quite a fairly obvious question from the conditions on the video. Why would they choose to live in such an exposed position? Is it just for protection?
Hannah,
yeah, well, I guess in some ways you've just kind of addressed some of those ideas of the wealth of natural resources that can be found on the coast even now, and certainly would have been tapped into by those communities. So that's definitely one aspect of being out there, is being up against the elements also offers you, fishing, opportunities for travel. And when we think about the environment and what the environment would have looked like in the Iron Age, then the sea is a very useful means of traveling. So that aspect of it is, in some ways, it's obviously the sea is dangerous, but traveling on land could also be dangerous. So that's, it's it might have been a really quite a useful tool for people to be positioning themselves on the coast.
And also, as we said, I mean, the houses at the time were extremely cosy. If you've ever been to Castlehead Iron Age village in Pembrokeshire, they've got houses there. They've rebuilt some of them actually now. Some of them stood for about 30 years. But the great storms of 1987 and later, the Iron Age houses were untouched. Once you get in there, it's cozy. You've got a fire on. In winter, if it's cold, you get some livestock in, get some sheep, get some goats, warm the house up, and you wouldn't even know there was a storm outside once the door was shut. Okay,
great. Thanks, Peter, for that very interesting question. Next question is from Gordon, and it says, did I hear you say that the cordon wasn't existent during the fort's occupation?
I think all the studies, we did a big study of coastal erosion a few years ago with Dyfed Archaeological Trust as well, and there are parts of Flimston which are actively eroding. They've lost 5 to 8 meters in the last decade, and parts of Flimston are very old, extremely old. And there's no active erosion on the cauldron blowhole at all. It's very, very old rock. So we assume that it existed in some form, probably a very similar form, 20 centuries ago. And you're only looking 2,000 years, you're looking at 20 centuries, nothing at all really. And we've seen that erosion on particularly limestone cliffs happens dramatically most of the time. So in 2017, Storm Ophelia knocked the nose off the Green Bridge Natural Arch, a very dramatic collapse there. So you'll have static cliffs for hundreds or thousands of years, and then enormous collapses.
Another comment on that as well is that Flimston's not the only promontory fort we have evidence of those kind of features. So Buckspool, just down the road from it, sometimes called the Castle, which is also on that same stretch of coast, has nowhere near as dramatic, but a similar limestone blowhole in the middle. So potentially we've got a few different examples of these geological features being incorporated into promontory forts for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you very much. Question from Jill: how would the boats access the fort?
Well, there's often at all these forts there are really good little beaches and inlets next to them to pull up, and many of the forts actually had good access down to the beach, despite their rocky cliffs. They had steps and accesses down, and there are records in the 19th century of promontory forts now where you can't even reach the sea in Pembrokeshire, which fishermen used to access down little cliff paths down to the beach as well. We've also done quite a lot of work this year with our new maritime archaeologist Julian Whitewright, who lives in St David's, and he reminds us, of course, that some of the currachs, the hide-bound boats like coracles in the Iron Age, if the terrain was tough, you just pick the boat up and carry it up the cliff to the fort. You don't really have to leave it on the beach. So there are many ways to access the coast edge from these forts.
Okay, thank you. Hilary has asked why whether we could do a version with a voiceover later on. I think we will be releasing a version with a transcript on it, so I think that might help some people where the sound goes a little bit. And then a question from John: was there a source of fresh water at the site? Not
an obvious source of fresh water. We're on the limestone here, after all. So the inhabitants will be wanting to catch as much water as they can when it rains. And there's also Frames Lake and so on. There's a river just inland on the Castlemartin Peninsula as well. But nowadays we demand quite a lot of water in our life. We want a cup of tea when we wake up in the morning, and so on. And that may not have been possible in the Iron Age. You may have had to send the children down to the river a mile away with some buckets and bags, leather bags, to bring water back. So it would have been a slightly drier spot on the limestone than inland Pembrokeshire.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And then Francis asks, were there settlements near to the site, and would the number living in the fort be restricted?
We've got a few up the coast, haven't we, Hannah?
Yeah. So just nearby to Flimston, which we almost catch in that film actually, is Croxydam Fort, which is really quite close by. Often with understanding these forts, it's not clear whether they were occupied at the same time, and that is a really lovely question for future research, is to understand the relationships between those different forts on the coast, whether they were friendly, whether they were contemporary, etc.
It's difficult. We've got 60 promontory forts around the coast of Pembrokeshire alone, and about 120 in Wales. And it's only now, recent years, we've been excavating two sites close together up near St David's, Port Werdd being excavated by the Dyfed Trust, and Caer promontory fort by the CHERISH project last year. There's some dig ventures. And we see Port Werdd occupation to the late Roman period, 4th century AD. Caer, no Roman pottery at all, completely abandoned when the Romans came. So there's lots of differences in how these places were occupied.
Yeah, interestingly, both Julian and Andrew have asked questions about whether there've been excavations at Flimston. I think you said that there hadn't been excavations. I mean, has there been any other kind of, just very small scale investigations gone on there? And I think Andrew says it's just so surprising on a site that's so clearly defined and visible, and it looks like it should be an obvious one to work on.
There have been antiquarian diggings at Croxydam, just down the road, just across the bay, where quantities of Roman pottery were discovered, and at Buckspool, which Hannah mentioned earlier on, there were antiquarian diggings there as well of the roundhouses in the 19th, early 20th century. And we're not aware of any diggings at Flimston, but I'm sure people have had a bit of a dig. What we didn't see on that day as well is a 19th century limestone quay. The road goes down to it at the tip of the promontory. So there would have been people walking through there all the time, probably looking at things and maybe digging them out. But all these sites need some good new scientific excavation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. There's a question from Heather, which I think is a question generally about the CHERISH project, actually, and which is about how what and how do CHERISH record the kind of changing climate and the climate change issues. I mean, how is that reflected in the work of that's been happening in CHERISH?
So what we've been monitoring in the CHERISH project is the effect of climate change on coastal sites. So some of our research we do take in paleoenvironmental research, which allows us to monitor prehistoric climate change, but none of our research is particularly looking at monitoring current changes in climate. What we do use is climate data from climate change scientists, to then apply to what we're doing. So to understand the effects of climate change on coastal sites, we've used quite a range of different techniques. For sites like Flimston, a key one has been things like survey. So to understand what the site looks like to create something like that plan that we showed at the start. So to show a representation of what's there now, and also understanding how quickly the coast is eroding. So one of the things we've done is to put in fixed survey markers so that going forward we can continue to accurately survey the site to understand how much is being lost.
And it's also it's a great project because we're able to work with colleagues in Aberystwyth University particularly, who are doing a lot of the paleo science, as Hannah was saying, and they've been doing coring and analysis of sand dune deposits at Stackpole down in Pembrokeshire, and also a lot in Western Anglesey and in North Pembrokeshire at Dinas Head as well, to sort of get these post-glacial deposits and these the Quaternary deposits way back before the Romans came to Wales, to really see how that climate change has happened over the longer period as well.
Okay, thank you very much. There's a couple of questions now about relationships between the fort and other places. So the first one is from Sean, who asks what might the extent of trade routes have been from, say, Ireland, Cornwall, and France?
Yeah, very interesting. I think if you've got a couple of hours, I can tell you all about the detail of that. But very briefly, I'm going to Dublin next week to talk about Wales and Irish trade in the Iron Age, and what we know and what we don't know. The things we do know is that the Greeks from the sort of 3rd, 4th century BC were charting Cornwall, Wales, Ireland. So Mona is named in the early records by the Greeks, and Prydain for Britain, and so on as well by the Britannia in the Greek as well for that. So we have reasonably good written records dating back to 3-4 centuries before the Roman conquest. There's good evidence of very similar promontory forts in Cornwall, particularly between Cornwall and Pembrokeshire. But we have a slightly different chronology in Ireland. We have promontory forts being built sort of 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries AD, rather than our Iron Age and pre-Roman promontory forts. But there is trade and exchange. Dublin Bay, Lambay Island, has a copper ingot from Anglesey on it. Also very similar talks from as we have at Caer on the sea. So we have some communication across the Irish Sea in prehistoric times. But in truth, there's an enormous amount more work that we need to do to understand how shipping was taken across, and whether we have ports of trade in the Iron Age as well across the Irish Sea. So it's a really huge subject, but it's very interesting.
Okay, thank you. And then the other one about connections is from Adrian, and he asks, how would this promontory fort have related to the inland fort at Warren? Are they of different eras, or is the promontory fort a site of last resort for the inland fort?
It's interesting. A lot of the sort of the earlier discussion, late 19th century, early 20th century, considers many of these forts to be refuges at times of strife. And we have Warren and Merrion Camp. There we have Bullaba Camp. We have some really big inland hill forts in the Castle Martin Peninsula. And across Pembrokeshire, over 400 Iron Age forts and defended enclosures. And while some of these may have been ceremonial enclosures or indeed refuges, we have small outcrop sites up on the Preseli Hills like Carnalu, which don't seem to be permanent farmsteads. but we have most of the evidence when we excavate these sites shows good, busy farming interiors, well populated with families living there. But we are talking about a long time. So if we're talking about 400 BC, the Middle Iron Age, through to the Roman conquest, AD 70, that's 400 or 500 years. That's our time back to Shakespeare's time. And over that period, there's been an awful lot of abandonment and reoccupation of different sites. So I think for the most part, these were permanent settlements, but maybe only for a generation or so, 30, 40 years, 50 years.
Okay, thank you. And then Ian asks, what evidence have you had that fish was caught and eaten at this site?
Interesting. Shall I hop into that one, Hannah? We really need good isotope analysis of bones to see what people's diets were. And in most of Wales, the soil is quite acidic, so bones dissolve. But actually here on the Castle Martin Peninsula, you would get burials. We have records of burials from Buxball, but we don't know where the bones have gone. A couple of things. Brown Slave Burrow was excavated a few years ago on the Castle Martin Peninsula, an early medieval burial site by the Dyfed Archaeological Trust. And I think I'm right in remembering that there wasn't any evidence from a marine diet in the bones of the people buried on the Castle Martin Peninsula. But I know that there's been an enormous amount of work done on St Patrick's Chapel out at St David's, huge amount of science being thrown at those early medieval burials. And it'd be interesting to come back and see the isotope analysis about where those people were born and what they were eating in their lifetime as well.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And thanks very much to Barbara for her comments and thanking us for this trip around Flimston, particularly a site that can be hard to get to for some people. So it really opens up for them. Thanks for those comments. Christopher asks, what proportion of the total number of Wales promontory forts are in Pembrokeshire?
60 out of 106, I think it is. So about 2/3. Yeah. It's a really busy place.
Okay.
Very few on Anglesey, which has a very similar indented coastline. So there's a puzzle there about why they all ended up being built in Pembrokeshire.
Yeah. And another question from Malcolm about the kind of economy on the site. Do you think there would have been metalworking and sort of intensive agriculture on the site?
Yes, potentially quite likely. As I say, because we've not excavated, we don't have evidence for metalworking. If we were to excavate, we could look at soil samples and have a look at the evidence of metalworking in that, which would be really great. It's quite likely we have evidence from other sites that people might have would have had animals inside the fort and also outside. And maybe also even have like small market gardens right next to their homes. So while they might well have been doing agriculture like outside the fort, and that might have been it would likely have been growing 6-row hulled barley as like quite a dominant crop, but potentially also wheat, potentially also working with woodland resources and keeping cattle. It's very likely people would have been keeping sheep. So all of those kind of activities, probably quite a mix of pastoral farming and arable farming, but all on quite a small scale. And again, if we were able to get good palynological evidence from Flimston and the surrounding area, that's a really good way to understand exactly what was going on and just exactly what people would have been growing and making and doing. So yeah, we need some soil is what we need from there.
Great. So it's all building up to an interesting about excavation, isn't it, really? And it'd be lovely to do it. And then Adrian makes a comment actually about the sort of later economy of the area, saying that there was a track on the eastern side of the promontory fort used for the export of pipe clay, and that you can still see some of the white clay near the wall at the bottom of the track, and the stone point was crudely levelled as a key for ships, and that the clay came from clay pits near Flimston Chapel. So obviously it's all
that key at Flimston is really interesting. We should have gone down there. We would have been blown into the sea. But all these ideas of the cliffs being difficult to walk on and dangerous and precipitous, and there you are in the 19th century taking wagon loads down to the quay, presumably bringing boats in close enough for things to be craned onto them, at the right turn of the tide, and it's extraordinary to look at it today and imagine a busy quay down there on this rocky promontory. So yeah, very interesting bit of post-medieval history there.
Yeah. Just remembering the Iron Age archaeology is just part of the archaeology, isn't it? Down there's lots of other archaeology. Richard asked, and I guess this is a wider question for Cherish as well. Whether you're seeing strong evidence of sea level change over the last 2 millennium.
Yeah, we've got. You might want to dive into this as well, Hannah. I mean, one of the key things we've been able to do is working with our colleagues in Aberystwyth University. Patrick Robson and Sarah Davis particularly, they've been doing cores on beach peat exposures, particularly up at Aberystwyth in North Wales. They've been doing a lot of work on inland lakes or coastal lakes in Anglesey in North Wales as well. And there's been a huge amount of change in some places. We've been working up at Gwynedd at Dinas Dinlley near Carnarvon, and the entire sand spit there, which Dinas Dinlley village is built on, it looks like it's actually formed after the Roman conquest. It's about 2,000 years old. So sea levels sort of stabilized about 2,500 to 3,000 BC, but there's been an enormous amount of coastal change, particularly with the movement of sand and sand dunes that have changed and inundated parts of the coast over the last 2,000 years. And we're getting some great data out of the CHERISH project on that now.
Okay. And we've actually come to the final question now. It's one by Richard. I think he's thrown down a bit of a challenge. He said it's great to see the blowhole and hear about the possible liminal aspects of the hill fort. How could you examine the blowhole archaeologically to test the liminal thesis?
Well, I'll tell you what. I mean, it's a dynamic environment down there. We have done some rope access work in the project. You'd be very lucky if anything survived down there. It wouldn't survive. But I know in Cornwall there are some Cornish cliff castles where, from the rock crevices and the outcrops, particularly at Trerindinas down in South Cornwall, we've actually got Bronze Age pottery and Iron Age pottery tucked into the rock crevices under this big rocking stone, which is quite a religious site of the Iron Age. And I think probably will be blown away from Flimston, but some sort of fingertip searches of key parts of these promontory forts would be really very useful bit of investigation for the future, see what does survive on these sites.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. That's the end of the questions. And thank you. Thank you everybody else who's dropped things into the chat. Very, very kind words in the chat as well about how many people have enjoyed this talk. So thanks very much once again for answering all those questions and for the talk. And Joch yn fawr I chi unwaith eto am sgwrs wych ac am ateb y holl cwestiynau. If anybody has any further questions, you're more than welcome to contact us after the talk, either through social media or by using the contact details on our website. I gloi, hoffwn ddiolch yn fawr I chi am ymuno â ni heno, I staff y Comisiwn am Drefnu ac yn olaf, diolch yn fawr iawn I chi, Hannah a Toby, am daith a sgwrs ddiddorol iawn. Thanks for everybody for joining us tonight. And thanks very much to the Commission staff who has been involved with the arrangements, and of course to Toby for a fascinating talk. Nos da.